next broadcast, please send $6.50 to Monitor Radio, Post Office Box 527, Boston, Massachusetts, 02117. This program is a copyrighted broadcast of the Christian Science Monitor.
This is the American Public Radio Network.
Stay tuned for Steve Paulson coming up next, and then tune in at 2 o'clock for the best of Tom Clark.
Contributors to Wisconsin Public Radio include Badger Gymnastics Academy of Madison, gymnastics instruction for children 2 years old and older, and Anchor Savings and Loan, providing personalized lending service to the Madison area for over 60 years. Good afternoon, I'm Steve Paulson. John Muir is commonly regarded as the father of the conservation movement. He was born in Scotland in 1838 and grew up in Wisconsin. In his late 20s, Muir moved to California, where he became entranced by the Sierra Mountains. Eventually, his campaign to turn Yosemite into a national park made Muir famous and one of the architects of the national park system. But Muir was not just a political figure. His deep reverence for nature and almost mystical way of writing about it has earned him the admiration of many nature lovers. One such admirer is Michael Cohen, an English professor at Southern Utah State College and author of the book The Pathless Way, John Muir and American Wilderness. Cohen argues that Muir's greatness lies in his ability to combine the roles of mystic and scientist, wilderness recluse, and political operative. I recently talked with Cohen about Muir's place in the conservation movement, his rebellion against 19th century attitudes about the wilderness, and his response to Thoreau and Emerson. You write at the end of your book about how it's impossible for you to talk about Muir in strictly objective scholarly terms, that you have to talk about yourself as well and how you've been personally affected by Muir. Why is John Muir so appealing to you?
Well, I guess what I wanted to say in the book was why John Muir was appealing to a generation of young people, especially ones who grew up in the 60s. In retrospect, we were growing up during a kind of environmental revolution, or at least a revolution of environmental consciousness in the United States. And we didn't know that, but we knew that Muir was important to us and grew more important as we read him, and especially in the context of 60s events, questions of North Cascades National Park, say, or Redwoods. And I think that, at least my background being literary, my interest was in the presentness of the past rather than the pastness of the past. My interest was in what Muir's Sierra meant to us, and I might argue the way in which we saw the Sierra through Muir's eyes.
My sense is that you and perhaps others of your generation respond to Muir's way of living, Muir's lifestyle, even more than what Muir wrote. And I don't know if that's a false distinction or not, if you can separate how Muir lived from how he wrote, but would you say that's generally true? What you really identify with is this man who just loved to walk around in the mountains?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think our elders also identified with that Muir. Rather remarkable poem by a literary critic, Ivor Winters, celebrating Muir's walking off into the wilderness. And Winters is a hard-headed fellow, so we did. However, I found that Muir's literary work actually reflected his life. Like the transcendentalists who influenced him, he felt that I suppose a man's life and a man's writing ought to be very close together.
Let's go into some background on Muir's life. He was born in Scotland. He grew up for the most part in Wisconsin. He went to the university in Madison. And throughout his youth, he loved to tinker with machines. He was something of an inventor. I know he exhibited some of his inventions at the State Fair in Wisconsin once. This sounds very much like someone who would become an engineer, not someone who would become the great environmentalist of the 19th century. Isn't there something that doesn't add up here?
I suppose it is. It might be worth noticing that nobody would have Muir's machines on display if he weren't a famous conservationist. It's that he was a famous conservationist, and therefore people noticed those machines that he used to make. There was obviously an important event in Muir's life where he was injured while working on an assembly line, and that made him realize that he was going to have to give up one thing in order to have another. He was going to give up the machine age, I suppose, in order to have his real love, which was botany at the time and throughout his life. There's something about wanting to understand how the cosmos works and wanting to make coherent machines, which is more harmonious in Muir's mind than perhaps it is in our minds. We don't think of the cosmos as a vast machine with many cogs and switches. I think that he did when he was young, and it might indicate something about Muir's mind when he was young, that he wanted to make very complex machines which I suppose were self-contained, and they all related to time, suggesting the degree to which he thought he had to make something of his own.
Why did he go west?
Well, went west because everybody went west. He went west not thinking he was going to stay there. He actually was simply looking for a place that was congenial. And as a matter of fact, his early journals suggest that he was by no means satisfied with the West, or at least with California, and planned to go to South America and elsewhere. I think the better question is why he stayed in the West, and the answer to that is that influences from Wisconsin, first of all, had moved to California, especially his favorite professor and his wife, Jean Carr. And secondly, America was moving west. And the focus of attention on that place and on Yosemite made it seem important to him.
Was there a certain point when he was in the mountains that he was suddenly won over by the glory, the grandeur of the mountains?
That's an interesting question. I found numerous occasions for that, and I think I only used a few in the book. The answer to that has to do with solitude. It also has to do with, I think, ridding himself of presuppositions of some sorts, but not of others. For instance, I don't think that Muir ever ceased to be a scientist in order to become a mystic. I don't think that he ceased to see beauty in order to see truth. Nevertheless, those moments did come to him, I believe, most frequently when he was actively involved in climbing, or at least passing through the landscape, rather than when he was passively viewing a particular scene.
So you see his significance basically as someone who brings this kind of mystical approach to the mountains. It's not as a scientist going out there studying the geological formations or the behavior of certain animals. It's more someone who steps back and has almost a religious experience.
I think people who tried to explain Muir's greatness, I'll take Muir's greatness as a given, especially in the period, say, from 1940 through 1960, tended to amplify his scientific significance or stature. Muir could observe well. He learned how to observe by reading Agassiz, and nevertheless, Muir is not an exceptional scientist. He came upon things which were important to the Sierra and to understanding it. But any one of the messages that Muir has to teach independently would not make him a particularly outstanding American thinker. It's the fact that he could somehow see in more ways than one, and have a harmonious vision, I suppose.
You title your book The Pathless Way. What do you mean by that term?
Beats me. It was a good title. I guess I was thinking about wilderness when I was writing the book, and I was looking in the Oxford English Dictionary, and of course Pathless Way is in fact an alternate definition for wilderness someplace back there. But I had a paradox in mind, which was quite simply that by definition wilderness is without a path, without a trail, and on the other hand, by getting lost in it, one ends up following trails not of one's own making. And that seems to me to be the secret to understanding what Muir was able to do, to let go and find the ways that nature provided.
Well, it's a very unscientific term. A scientist, you would think, say, wanting to study a glacier out there would come up with a certain hypothesis about how it moves or where it was formed and go on a path and try to figure that out. But it seems that John Muir did not think in those terms.
Well, I think he did more than one might give him credit for. The people who found Muir to be an ignorant shepherd frequently had not observed so closely nor followed their experiments so carefully in matters of glacial history of the Sierra particularly as Muir himself. There's no question but that Muir came to believe that the Sierra were created by glaciers and tended to assemble data to support his contention. Nevertheless, he also went out on glaciers and placed stakes and found out whether they moved and did the kind of close observation and testing of his ideas that suggested he wasn't working on intuition alone. Muir was very much a realist, I suppose both a literary realist and also philosophically a materialist when it came to looking at glaciers. He could use metaphors to describe them as God's great carving tool, but he also looked for the places where the tools impressed the rock. So I think that, as I say, Muir's scientific method is not exceptional, but it is very much a scientific method of his age. He was following Louis Agassiz and other prominent American scientists very carefully. He read his science carefully. His books suggest that.
We should mention that Louis Agassiz was probably maybe the foremost scientist of the time, at least before Darwin came along, and was the one really to try to say that different animals, different plants had a certain kind of form that really didn't evolve, if I'm summing that up.
Louis Agassiz is important for two reasons. First reason Louis Agassiz is important is method. Louis Agassiz is the man who introduced to America a way of teaching science and studying science whereby the observer compares slides. One hands the observer two specimens and says, how is this like that? So that basic to the scientific method in America is the Louis Agassiz method. The second question, however, has to do with conclusions that one draws when one compares, for instance, 7 different fossils from 7 different ages. Louis Agassiz refused to make the leap which Darwin made and to say that one led to the next. He simply said, I see 7. They appear to be in a scale of increasing complexity, but I will not say that one evolved from the other. Therefore, Agassiz, even though he was generally judged wrong, was also a scientist of integrity and a scientist of scrupulous method. And Muir followed the close look part of Agassiz. Muir was, in fact, a Darwinist.
Mm-hmm. Did Muir have a certain concrete philosophy about how people were supposed to relate to nature, or was it more of an intuitive understanding?
I think Muir worked that out fairly carefully at one point in his life, and although he drifted away from his early decisions, they amounted to the following, that the universe is simply not made for men. Men have the great privilege to participate in it, but they should not assume that it is theirs alone. They are but one citizen. I don't think that conflicts with the fact that later on in Muir's life he became very much an enthusiast for tourism, for other kinds of popular recreation. He was not saying by that the world is one great tour. However, at times one wishes he reminded the reader to be careful of the fragility of the world.
When you say Muir was talking about humans being just one cog in the universe, that's very modern. I think just about all environmentalists now would say that, but I know that that was really a radical statement in the 19th century, that there were all kinds of other attitudes that were prevailing at that time about nature. One was that there was something very hostile about nature. There was almost a biblical sense that there was sin in nature. I think perhaps the British critic John Ruskin wrote about nature as being sinful, even being ugly. Nature was to be feared. And perhaps one of the best examples of how people approached nature at that time was in mountain climbing. People went to the Matterhorn in Switzerland to conquer the mountain. It was a question of men conquering nature, and Muir really turned that thinking totally on its head.
You might argue, of course, that Muir was not so much radical as he was conservative. I suppose that a certain strain of Calvinist view of nature calls for seeing man as small in the cosmic context. And I used, for instance, in my book, Jonathan Edwards as a gloss on that. And Muir certainly had a strong Calvinist background, which he rebelled against. But that one element of Calvinism may remain, and it's the one which asks that we distrust ourselves. The second question, however, has to do with the nature of the mountaineering enterprise. Again, Muir was quite conscious of the European tradition and the American tradition. I think that, the British tradition can be boiled down, I suppose, to at least two and perhaps three issues. One is, of course, you build character when you climb mountains. The other is that you get to see beautiful scenes. And the third is that you, I suppose, test yourself for the conquest of nature which will follow. In other words, this is just getting in shape. You can see that. I was just reading an article in the airplane about executives going on outward bound trips so that they can work out teamwork in order to fulfill the needs of their corporations, presumably profit motive. So that's very much with us today. I think that Muir's notion, however, as a small citizen of a large universe, Muir's purpose in climbing the mountain, aside from understanding the mountain itself, which is important, was to remind himself of exactly what his scale was with respect to that mountain. Muir on Mount Whittle recognizes, one, that he's insignificant, and two, that he may very well die, and three, it will make no difference. And that is not conquest. Now, one does see that in a good deal of modern existential mountaineering literature. You can find it in Lionel Terray, to use my favorite example, or perhaps Herzog's book Annapurna. And I think Muir may have been indeed moving toward a modern perspective on at least human activity in nature. Yes, it's futile, but to conquer, but on the other hand, one learns so much about oneself and about one's role in the universe that it's valuable.
Now return to Steve Paulson's conversation with Michael Cohen, author of The Pathless Way, John Muir and the American Wilderness. But first, a reminder that coming up next, it's the best of Tom Clark. In the first hour, Tom discusses relations between the U.S. and Soviet Union with Michael Parenti, physical scientist and author of several books on U.S. foreign relations.
If we talk about attitudes in the 19th century about nature, we could also talk about aesthetic attitudes as well. There was a long tradition of a certain way to write about nature, to paint nature. There were terms like the sublime, the beautiful, the picturesque that had certain aesthetic definitions. And you suggest that Muir, at least at first, rebelled against that tradition as well. He didn't want to view nature through these mediated kinds of definitions. He wanted to be overwhelmed by nature, to respond to it more intuitively. And you suggest that that's part of Muir's larger critique of what we might call humanism, that puts humanity at the center of everything, that nature is almost a reflection of the human being. You're rather hard on humanism. Do you want to explain a little bit about the problem you see with that kind of philosophy?
I'm glad you noticed that we may be talking about what I was saying rather than what Muir was saying. I think that Muir did indeed distrust categories, particularly in this case aesthetic categories, and he distrusted them because they suggested that somehow the forces or the energy of nature could be simplified into, say, beautiful, sublime, and picturesque, or any of a number of other categories. They seem as arbitrary as foreground, middle ground, and background in a sense, and that's, I think, what I tried to argue. That is part of Muir's critique. Muir was more interested, I suspect, in the process of perceiving nature than in the conclusions. That is to say that if you travel all day for 3 days in the Sierra, what you come out with is not beautiful, sublime, or picturesque scenes. What you come out with is an experience, a complex experience, which certainly includes beauty, and very frequently you will remember the beauty in conventional terms. Nevertheless, the experience itself is more than the sum of the parts, and I suppose that's what I was saying. But there's something else, and that has to do with the nature of humanism. A humanistic view says, quite simply, we see the beauty in nature, or the sublimity, and see how grand we are as a result. And Muir's tendency was to say, we see how beautiful or sublime nature is, and see how grand nature is. The difference being that we either have increasing respect for the observer or increasing respect for the observed. The danger of having increasing respect for the observer, or the artist, or the categorizer, or even the painter, is that one comes to think that nature is not so important as the uses that humans put it to. If that's true, then of course we don't need the Grand Canyon after we've sent our best painters there. And we don't need Mount Ritter after somebody's climbed it. It has served its human purpose, and we can do with it now as we will. So I believe that Muir's philosophy is coherent. He does believe that nature is more important than human uses, and therefore it provides an ongoing resource that is greater than any man, or any man's ability to say what he sees.
We've been talking so far mainly about how Muir was different than a lot of the other thinkers of the time. There was perhaps one person who was quite similar in philosophy, and that was Henry David Thoreau, who was a little bit older than Muir, I think 21 years older. He died relatively young, and presumably Muir was able to read just about everything that Thoreau had published when Muir was still in the formative stages of developing his values. And most of Muir's major themes can be found in Thoreau earlier, and I would imagine that some people would look at Muir as almost a cheap imitation of Thoreau, and I want to talk about that a little bit. I want to run through some of the common themes in those two thinkers. One, most obviously, is the worship of nature, looking at nature in a pantheistic kind of way, perhaps responding to a loss of belief in Christian faith. Another would be Thoreau's appreciation of simple living, his love of wildness. Thoreau wrote about wild apples. Muir wrote about wild sheep. They both wrote about wild men, why they're important, why wildness is important. Thoreau's realization after his trip to Mount Katahdin in Maine that humans are not the lords of nature. Thoreau's sense that the earth is an organic whole, even the rocks are constantly changing. There's nothing in nature that's dead. His choice of nature over history, his choice of nature over the progress of society, all those are themes that you find in Thoreau before you find them in Muir. And there are perhaps some issues, too, that Thoreau dealt with more thoroughly than Muir did. I think Thoreau had more of a sense, more of an appreciation of the lifestyle of Native Americans. And you suggest in your book that Muir never really came to terms with that, and Thoreau quite explicitly admired the way Native Americans lived. Thoreau also made a conscious effort to live simply. That's one of the messages in Walden, and you also suggest that because Muir never actually made his livelihood in the wilderness,
he perhaps didn't come to that same realization of the economic consequences of when you're out living in the wild. I've raised this all to suggest that perhaps Muir was not a terribly original thinker, but I'm sure that you would disagree with that. How would you respond?
Thoreau also didn't live off the land.
Yes, we can hardly say that living at Walden Pond is living in the wilderness 1 mile out of Concord.
Your question is very convincing, actually. First of all, let me say that in a conversation I remember once with Donald Worster, who's an environmental historian I respect a great deal, Worster said essentially the same thing you're saying, which is that if you want to go for ideas, you go to Thoreau. And I think that's right. And I see the influence of Thoreau on Muir very strongly. There's no question that Thoreau's ideas, which were often ideas sort of extended to their logical limits, were important to Muir. Also, Thoreau's sometimes very confrontational way of writing was very formative, especially of the young Muir's writing, which is why if you really want to get a good sense of Muir, you look at the early articles for Overland Monthly or newspaper articles. So I tend to agree, first of all, that Muir took a great many of his ideas from Thoreau. Although we are told that Walden is a testing of ideas, I think that the reading of the book suggests that it's not so much a testing as a sermon on them. And I think that Muir, to a greater extent than Thoreau, first of all, tested his ideas by asking whether they would work in a truly wild circumstance, which is not to slight Thoreau, but simply to say that Muir took the ideas further into the wilderness than, and I think Muir's early first biographer said that. Muir took Thoreau's ideas further into the wilderness than Thoreau himself. But that's true, and it reveals something of a guide to the way those ideas work in practice. I think there's another point, and that is that Muir became a public man in a way that Thoreau did not. And as a result, we have national parks which Muir was able at least to influence in terms of their creation, but also their size and their ideas about their function, and that made Muir's ideas that gave them flesh in a way that Thoreau's did not acquire. But also, Muir was a more limited man than Thoreau, if you want to think of him simply in terms of his ideas. Thoreau had a social vision which encompassed a great deal more than Muir's. So in some ways Muir was more of a specialist. That's to ask a question, who has the most ideas or who has the most coherent ideology. There's another question too, and that is about them as literary figures. We do not ask of literary figures that they necessarily be original in terms of ideas. We ask that they express ideas in a way that they can please many and please long. And one might argue that Muir does that very well indeed for place. One has a sense of place from Muir's writing that is very important. We know the Sierra from the mountains of California. We know all kinds of places from Muir's essays. We know about canyons, we know about rivers, we know about wildlife, and in certain ways his essays are, I suppose, at the expense of sounding sentimental, I'd say that Muir's essays are more endearing than Thoreau's. Thoreau rarely ever suggests that we can sit alongside him and have his experience. Muir is far more willing to share than Thoreau.
You also get a sense that Muir's appreciation of nature was a little bit deeper than Thoreau's, that Thoreau was a humanist in a sense, even though he talked about man not being the lord of nature. He never really got rid of that Emersonian way of thinking that nature is in some sense a reflection of human nature, and my impression is that Muir went beyond that.
I think that's probably right. I think Thoreau wanted to have it both ways, and so do I. In fact, I think that most of us, when pushed, will admit that if we were not humanists at all, we would not be very interesting or valuable human beings. There are hints of a more radical Thoreau or a more radical environmentalist Thoreau. There are hints of a more radical political Thoreau. Neither are developed. Talking about Thoreau in terms of Native Americans, one hears a great deal about the great poem that Thoreau was going to write about Indians, but he didn't write it. And so we have a great many hints suggesting that Thoreau might have done something more. I would only say that Muir's tended to complete his projects in a certain kind of single-mindedness. That is, his projects in terms of writing, but also his projects in terms of preserving the roof of the Sierra or a more radical environmentalist Thoreau. There are hints of a more radical political Thoreau. Neither are developed. Talking about Thoreau in terms of Native Americans, one hears a great deal about the great poem that Thoreau was going to write about Indians, but he didn't write it. And so we have a great many hints suggesting that Thoreau might have done something more. I would only say that Muir's tended to complete his projects in a certain kind of single-mindedness. That is, his projects in terms of writing, but also his projects in terms of preserving the roof of the Sierra for Americans of the future to see, in a way with a longevity and tenacity, which is of itself of some value. He was not flighty, and he also did not simply speak in order to wake up his compatriots. He kept them awake, and he was willing to do some mundane political things to see that his ideas became something more than ideas. It was not particularly easy for Muir to spend time with Teddy Roosevelt or Taft or E.H. Harriman's chief counsel, a man whose name was Heron and was a remarkably corrupt fellow who announced that he had controlled the progressive movement in California. Muir did those things, I don't think, for his own pleasure, but rather because he believed that parks were something that Americans would need.
Just to follow up quickly on that connection between Thoreau and Muir, you mentioned a humorous story about Muir's meeting with Emerson, the great Emerson, of course, Thoreau's mentor, and this is when Emerson was quite old, very famous. He went out to Yosemite, and from what I gather, neither man was very impressed with the other.
Oh, I think that's not true. I think they were both impressed. Well, Emerson left a list of his favorite, he called it My Men, and Muir was on that list, suggesting, of course, that Emerson was impressed with Muir. Muir has had very good things to say about Emerson, and particularly on Emerson's death. I think that Muir was not impressed with the Emerson who came to Yosemite Valley, and that is a different thing. I think that Muir recognized that the Emerson he was seeing was not the Emerson who had written Nature. And that's something that literary historians also have to realize, that the late Emerson had become rather a popularizer of his own ideas, and that the Emerson who went around the West with his literary entourage was not the one who startled himself awake.
You get the sense that Muir felt that, at least when Emerson came to visit, that this was really a man of the Eastern establishment. He really didn't have much of a direct connection with nature. He really didn't appreciate those wonderful mountains.
There's certainly, well, of course he said that he quotes what Emerson says under the sequoias. It's certainly true that he couldn't get Emerson to go out and camp with him. It's certainly true that Muir went out and slept in the woods while everybody else stayed at the hotel. It bothered Muir a great deal that Emerson simply was incapable, for social or personal reasons, of following his own advice. And I think that, as near as I can make out, Muir never said satirical things about Emerson, but he did say satirical things about the party. That is to say that I think Muir understood that there was a social reality which led Emerson to act the way he did. What it amounted to, of course, was that Muir was young, anxious, full of ideas, wanted to show off, and wanted to tell Ralph Waldo Emerson what he thought about the Sierra, and wanted to get him alone to do it. And so there was a certain amount of jealousy there, too. Muir did not like sharing Emerson when he came to Yosemite.
You say that there were some aspects of Muir's philosophy, if he did have a philosophy, that perhaps didn't quite fit together. One was he had a rather troubled way of thinking about the nature of predators. You say that he was very admiring of the coyote, but yet he didn't write about the coyote in such favorable ways as he wrote about, say, the squirrel or about mountain sheep. And perhaps this ambivalent attitude might be traced to his work as a shepherd. Obviously, the coyote would be the enemy in that case. Perhaps having to do with the attitudes of the time. Predators were shot on sight. The Westerners wanted to eradicate the coyotes. How did Muir come to terms with the role of predators, with perhaps that dark side of nature?
Not very well. I suppose that what we're talking about is Muir's Darwinism. To simplify greatly, one might think of evolutionary processes in two different ways. One has to do with the ability of a species to adapt to an environment, its flexibility, its resilience, and another has to do with the more, I suppose, traditional and vulgarized concept of survival of the fittest, who has the sharpest teeth. Muir obviously preferred the former. He wanted to think of evolutionary processes and adaptation. He wanted to see mountain sheep as perfectly suited to their environment and water ouzels as perfectly suited to their environment. He, on the other hand, did not want to see or think about predation to any great extent, because it suggested that the processes of nature were not entirely loving, I suppose. Muir wished to have a loving God and wished to have a loving process. He was squeamish, and he was squeamish very much in the way that a number of Victorian gentlemen and gentlewomen have been squeamish. On the other hand, I cannot think of a time when can remember ever seeing Muir say a bad word for any animal, predator or not. So that he didn't say bad words about coyotes or wolves or bears or eagles or any obviously predator species. He simply didn't want to talk about the way they got their living, just as he didn't particularly want to take meat into the backcountry.
I'm Steve Paulson. In a few minutes, we'll return to the interview with Michael Cohen, author of the book The Pathless Way, John Muir, and American Wilderness. But we have some business to take care of first, and Peter Wallace is with me. What you're hearing now is a brand new program on Wisconsin Public Radio, a program that I'm very excited about. It's a program that deals with history. Thank you for that call. That's why we're here right now. The number to call, 263-2244, if you're in the 608 area code. But anyways, this is a brand new program dealing with a variety of historical topics: cultural history, social history, political history. And it's a subject that fascinates me. Obviously, today you've been hearing about John Muir, the naturalist. Just to give you an idea of some of the topics coming up next week, I'll be talking with a biographer of the American novelist William Faulkner. A little bit later on, I'll talk with an old German colonel named Hans von Luck about his experiences in World War II. He was a close confidant of Rommel, the German field marshal, and he'll talk about his experiences with Rommel in North Africa, his invasion into Russia, and his experiences as a prisoner in a Russian prison camp after the war. And you'll also hear an interview with the noted historian William Appleman Williams about the Cold War. That's just to give you some sense of some of the topics coming up. But we need to hear from you right now. If this is the kind of programming you like, if you want to hear this historical programming with some of the top scholars around, some of the top scholars in the country, the number to call, 263-2244 or 1-800-255-2255, and that extension is 9772. Peter, do you have a sense of how we're doing?
We're doing pretty well today, Steve. We had a very busy morning, lots of pledges. The Wedding No program did very well for us today, and we're not going to be proceeding past 2 o'clock this afternoon on this particular day of the microdrive, in part because this evening we have premiere of the new Noah Adams program. Actually, it's being billed as a preview program, so that'll be on this evening on Wisconsin Public Radio. And, of course, tonight is our 70th birthday party for WHA and Wisconsin Public Radio. So this is really a last opportunity today, and we hope that you'll take advantage of it. Again, 608-263-2244. It's weekend, of course, so the long-distance rates are really not very high if you're calling from out of town. But if you would prefer us to pay for the call, that would be 800-255-2255. and ask for 9772 when you call. We do have just about $20,000 so far today, and we're very pleased with that. And actually, we're just a little over $400 away from that. So if you could help us eclipse the $20,000 mark before 2 o'clock, we would be very grateful for that.
And I especially hope that you call during this hour to show that you like this kind of interview, but you've been listening for the last 40 minutes or so. It's really something different than most of the things you hear on Wisconsin Public Radio. As you probably know, we have a number of call-in shows, which I am very involved in, and I'm a big supporter of call-in shows. But this program that you've been hearing is an example of a different kind of program that doesn't take calls and perhaps allows a little more depth, a little more time spent with the scholar on his or her particular specialty, and it's something of an experiment. And if that's the kind of thing you want to hear on Wisconsin Public Radio, we need to hear from you right away. 263-2244. That's 608-263-2244. That phone has not been ringing lately, so we'd love to hear a few jingles there.
Many people are unaware that to become a member of Wisconsin Public Radio is not at all difficult, and in fact only requires a contribution from you in the amount of perhaps $15 if you're a senior citizen, $30 if not is a basic pledge. We have contributors that pledge up into $120, $250, $500, but we're very happy to have the $30 contributors as well. Our telephone number again, 608-263-2244. You'll then receive a pledge packet from us, which you can then use to send in your check if you wish. We do, by the way, accept charge card pledges now right over the phone, so that all you need to do is have your Visa or MasterCard handy. You can call up and take care of your pledge right here and now. We have had, again, about, 435 calls so far today, and we appreciate each and every one of those. Wish that you would join our club. We have approximately 22,000 members of the Wisconsin Public Radio Association, but it isn't a satisfactory number until you're among those who are members. 608-263-2244. Make that $30 pledge now before we go back to the interview, and again, will be the end of pledging for today in this very brief microdrive that we're holding.
That number again, thank you for that call. That number again, 608-263-2244. There are a lot of expenses that we have at Wisconsin Public Radio. Just to give you a very brief idea, National Public Radio dues add up to something in the neighborhood of $324,000. That includes All Things Considered, Morning Edition, Weekend Edition, various special events like the Iran-Contra hearings that were broadcast a few months ago. Getting the Associated Press wire copy costs something like $12,000 a year. For our call-in shows, the 800 number that we have so that you don't have to spend your own money when you call in on one of the talk shows, that comes to something like $35,000 a year. There are big expenses here, and if you are a regular listener, if you are a participant on these programs, speaking of call-in shows, we need to hear from you. We need to hear from you right away because we're not going to be doing this much longer. That number again, 608-263-2244.
Well, I think we'll wrap up now and head back to the interview. I'd like to encourage you again to make your call now, so that as the afternoon progresses and tomorrow and then through the day Monday, you'll be able to rest assured that you've done your part and have become a member of Wisconsin Public Radio. Our 800 number, 255-2255, that's extension 9772, and our direct dial number, 608-263-2244.
As we've mentioned before, Muir later in his life became a public figure. By the 1880s, he was dealing with some explicitly political kinds of things. He was most of all interested in trying to turn Yosemite into a national park, something along the lines that Yellowstone had been turned into a national park. And he hooked up with a man named Robert Johnson, who edited the magazine Century. Can you tell us about their collaboration and what they were trying to achieve?
Robert Underwood Johnson had been an editor at Scribner's Monthly before he became an editor at Century. Let me refer to another historian. Stephen Fox points out in his book on John Muir and the American Conservation Movement that the Johnson-Muir collaboration is a kind of archetype of American conservationists collaborating. Typically, there are two sides to any conservation campaign, and one side has to be worldly, has to be based at the seat of power, which is Washington, D.C., and has to involve somebody who is himself capable of existing in such a world. And that person has to make hard-headed compromises and has to lobby Congress and do things like that. The other person has to have a sufficient, first of all, grasp of the place itself, and secondly, the ability to express why the place is valuable. So in that sense, the Muir-Johnson collaboration was particularly felicitous, I guess, because Johnson was exceptionally able to do the things in Washington. Muir was able to write the things in California. And they worked together for many years, from essentially from 1890 until Muir's death, which is 14 years.
What were their explicit?
24, excuse me.
What were their explicit goals?
Their explicit goals. First of all, it's still hard to determine whose goals they were. I'd argued in my book that they were primarily Muir's goals. Their goal, first of all, was generally to produce parks for America. Specifically with regard to Yosemite, the goal that Muir and Johnson saw was to put together a park which was ecologically whole. That is to say that it held a sufficient amount of, it held its own watershed in such a way that it was self-contained. Muir actually had in mind two separate watersheds for the Yosemite. This is complicated by other political matters. The state of California held land. There were other problems. However, that was Muir's conception, and I think that Johnson was largely in agreement. Johnson saw that the decision had to be made in long terms, that it couldn't be made about the scenery in Yosemite Valley. It had to be made in order to protect the sources of that scenery. And so I think they were in complete agreement with regards to the nature of a Yosemite Park. Johnson was a very good sport. He was an Easterner. He was not well traveled in the wilderness. He went with Muir wherever Muir took him. He tended to take advice very well when it came to campaigns. He was an excellent editor. And Johnson was also responsible for the creation of the Sierra Club and responsible for a good deal more. He believed in, I suppose, something we might call responsible journalism. The purpose for publishing a Muir essay was so that Johnson could take it to Congress. And when he took it to Congress, the purpose of taking it to Congress was to make a park. And that's what they did together.
You've spoken as if having a national park is the most wonderful thing in the world, but there's also a downside to that as well. You are presumably creating a park that a lot of people are going to come in to see. You're going to build roads of access in so that lots of tourists can come in and peer over a canyon or something like that and then leave the next day or leave that day. And I know that Muir had very ambivalent attitudes about these tourists. On the one hand, he scorned them in a sense. He didn't think that these people really could come to appreciate nature with just these short visits.
But yet he also, at other times, spoke as if perhaps such a short visit could win these people over. They would almost be converted in a religious sense. They would suddenly see, they would suddenly be touched by the natural glory of it. Did Muir see the creation of public lands like national parks as being a kind of a two-way street? It wasn't necessarily all for the good.
Well, there's several things here. Let me bring up, first of all, the question of the nature of public lands, say in 1890. First of all, Muir lived in a world where the public lands were rapidly being destroyed in one way or another. I shouldn't use the passive voice. People were destroying them. Corporations were destroying them. Railroads were destroying them. Individual entrepreneurs were destroying them. Ignorance was destroying public lands. But there was no set pattern in terms of the policy on the public domain. Therefore, Muir began, let's say, in the mid-1890s, aside from the question of national parks, in terms of reservations. At that point, it was quite sufficient for Muir and for a number of his colleagues to simply suggest that the federal government ought to reserve certain land. By that, they meant not necessarily parks, not necessarily what we would call national forests. Now, they simply meant that the public interest should be served by the federal government controlling these lands. The question of whether a particular place ought to be a park or a forest or a BLM wilderness area, these are technical issues which had not been worked out in any detail at all. Muir further felt, and I think this is not an unreasonable attitude, that it was better to have a lot of tourists crawling all around a grove of redwoods than to have no redwoods at all. As much as one might damage the wilderness experience by putting too many people into a wilderness, it was damaged more if there was no wilderness to put people into. So that issue is one of gradation. The early Muir was greatly troubled by tourists because he saw them as doing something fashionable but not something essential. The young Muir in Yosemite Valley, well, he was a guide, and guides, the occupational hazard of guides is that they get tired of their clients. And Muir watched people in Yosemite fashionably doing the valley, and he was disturbed to discover that they were not moved by the place. Later on, I think that he grew a little bit more moderate in his attitude, or perhaps he came to realize that you couldn't expect everybody to immediately be inspired. And he began to be far more accepting of tourism, especially in our national parks, which was written in 1901. And that is a book specifically written to support the idea of federal reserves. So one doesn't know for sure whether Muir is saying it in order to fulfill a higher aim or whether he actually has accommodated himself to tourism. The fact remains that tourism to Muir was a lot better than none. He would like to have a higher grade of tourism. And I think his advice generally for the occasional visitor was, don't try to do too much, don't try to see too much, try to see intensely. And I suspect his advice is as good as any that one might get. In other words, if you have one day in Yosemite, don't try to go to Brattleville Falls and Nevada Falls and Yosemite Falls and Half Dome and Sentinel Dome and the top of El Capitan and such, but rather go to one place and stay there and find out where you are. That advice, which he gave often and through his whole career, seems to me essentially good advice, suggesting that the kind of tourism is more important than that it exists. How one goes to see a place may have a great deal of impact. By the way, his method of for instance, seeing Yosemite is also what we might call minimum impact backpacking. There is a benefit to the Muir method of going into the wilderness, and that is that you don't mess the place up.
Was Muir involved in the creation of the Sierra Club?
Yes, he was. It was not necessarily Muir's idea, and I think that, in fact, a number of people wanted a number of organizations in the Bay Area at the time. And since I've been working on the Sierra Club history, I've decided that one can't trace any one group down. There was interest in in an alpine club, especially at the University of California, Berkeley campus. There was also interest specifically in a organization to protect Yosemite Park. It was Robert Underwood Johnson's idea to protect Yosemite Park, and that was why he wanted the Sierra Club. The name probably came from one of the Berkeley members, as it turned out, from the University of California. Muir's role in the Sierra Club was, I guess, as patriarch. There's not really any other way to describe him. He was president for life. He did not do the groundwork. He was, of course, getting older. The Sierra Club did not always do what Muir wanted either, right from the very beginning, and particularly in the matter of the dam at Hetch Hetchy Valley. A good many members of the Sierra Club felt that the dam, which would provide fresh water for San Francisco and for Oakland, would be an excellent idea. And Muir found that in order for him to do battle with what he thought was a desecration of a national park, he had to, in fact, organize a separate group. So the Sierra Club was in no sense just Muir's organization. And it's also true that the Sierra Club has veered away from and returned to Muir's ideas to various extents over the years. For instance, I think that after Muir had died, the Sierra Club became, to a much greater extent, an organization supporting the national parks and Stephen Mather's ideas of the national park as park director, and remained that way. And so the argument goes that the Sierra Club only came back to Muir when a group of, well, they called themselves the Young Turks. The Young Turks, namely David Brower, Ansel Adams, and Richard Leonard, all young, relatively young board members in the late 30s and early 40s, took control of the club and reasserted ideas about limiting development, about keeping parks wild. It may be that it was only then that it became Muir's club again, or at least it came closer to Muir's ideals. But the fact was that Yosemite did need a Sierra Club, Yosemite National Park. There was a necessity for protecting the park. The park was proclaimed, but not very well administered. And it was still administered, at least when the Sierra Club was founded, it was still being administered by both the federal government and the state. There wasn't a National Park Service. There were no park rangers. At various times, the U.S. Army served in Yosemite Park, and very well. There was a need for some kind of public organization which would influence government policy on the disposition of the lands and the way they would be maintained. The whole conception of a national park had not been worked out in any great detail. And that was one of the primary purposes of the Sierra Club, was to simply offer a vehicle for what it turned out to be sort of a group of civic-minded, generally politically conservative progressives in the San Francisco Bay Area to try to have a voice in terms of the preserving of the beauty of their state. It was by no means a radical group, but it was an essential one.
Do you think people should look at Muir as mainly an historical figure, as someone who talked about the needs of the environmental movement, or there was really no movement at the time, but of what had to be done to preserve nature during the late 19th century, or does Muir still have something to say to us in the 1980s?
I think Muir has something to say to us. One might step back and argue that whatever wilderness is, it is of great value to us. And our definitions, our ideas about wilderness are likely to be multiple, and no set of them will be inclusive. That is to say that wild nature is the source of our cultural and individual identities. And Muir's pointing that out so well is worth taking notice. The question about Muir's being the definitive statement about wilderness or the function of parks seems well-founded. Nobody can give a definitive statement, and in fact the uses of parks will change. Parks haven't been around very long. Wilderness has been around, at least as an idea in terms of public policy, for a much shorter time. We have a long history ahead of us of using and changing these lands which we believe we ought to hold intact for our sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters. And I suppose Muir's main message is that we ought to hold them intact.
So you would say Muir's significance now is as this kind of a political figure to make sure that we have these public lands set aside, but my impression as I was reading your book is that his significance is really more in terms of a spiritual guide on showing us, or at least helping us to teach us a little bit better on how to respond to nature.
The argument might go something like this, that unless you know what you are in the wilderness, you're incapable of appreciating what the wilderness is good for. I believe that Muir's first and perhaps best use is as a guide to how to go into the mountains or any wild area and learn something about yourself and the place. I think that's the foundation on which rests any policy decision you might want to make or at least have influence on. In other words, personal integrity comes before political action, and I think Muir's personal integrity was impeccable. I also think that a good deal of his work describes in very careful detail not simply what he did, but what one does when one is in the wilderness in order to learn something about it. I've been criticized for this view, by the way, and the criticism usually goes as follows, that I'm asking Muir to be both mystic and realistic. I'm asking Muir to be both cosmic and programmatic. I think that Muir, perhaps because he lived in a slightly easier age, is really quite a model that we might reach towards of being both a full human being and also an effective political force. I would not want to say we should give up one and keep the other. I think it's precisely the degree to which he was able to harmonize his motives and his actions that make him an admirable man.